Hey y'all, so I have a bit of an announcement before the video starts. As you can probably see, this is one of, if not the longest video I've posted on this channel thus far. Now, I know that some people like long-form videos, in fact, I am one of them, but this series, Underhill, just seems to be getting longer and longer each time I upload a video. So, as I said, there's an announcement. Henceforth, the videos of this series will be closer in length to my other works, both for y'all's benefit and my own. This will start as soon as the next upload for Underhill, so keep a lookout for that. And since we're already here, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe if you want to help out the channel. It helps with the algorithm. And for that matter, go ahead and share this video if you like it, or any of the other videos on my channel if you happen to have listened to any of those. Now, this is already starting to drag on, and the video's already quite long, so let's just get going with the story. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy. Underhill, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Thursday, January 19th. The air of the house went dead silent as Sarah cursed. She growled a sigh and propped up the vacuum for the 8th time, striding out of the living room to put the plug back in it, only to glare. She patted her thighs, jaw grinding off center as she turned her back on the plug, firmly in place, and returned to the vacuum. "I swear, if you work—" She cocked it back and stomped the pedal. It revved to life, sucking up the dirt as she grimaced and balled up her fists, words failing as she searched for a curse. Then the tension dropped with her expression, leaving her heavy and blank as she stood straight, gripped the handle, and pushed it over the last dirty spot in the house. Minutes later, she wound the cord and dragged the temperamental thing to the linen closet beside the pantry, tossing it in its corner before dragging her hands over her face with a groan. She eyed the mop, pointing an accusing finger as choice words sat poised at the back of her mouth. She squinted, glaring daggers, but said nothing as she jerked the mop from the hook on the wall. Its neighbors, the brooms, the second mop, the duster, and the cobweb duster, came with it, crashing down across the room and sending the old mop bucket spinning on its side over Sarah's foot. She slid back, wide eyes falling heavy as she clenched her jaw and stared into the void, ignoring the new mess as she breathed deeply. "One thing. I just want one thing to go right today." She crouched and gathered the tangle of rods, cursing them under her breath and scolding them like a sour teacher before she stopped and rehung them. And now I'm yelling at inanimate objects. Her heavy eyes shut in the dim room as she spun, shutting the door and heading to the sink with a spray mop in hand. She fished the bottle of cleaner from the sink cabinet and set it on the island, half tempted to tell it not to spill and stopping herself as she undid the lid. She held it over the mop's reservoir and steadied her hands, ignoring the cinnamon and warm spices of the cleaner to stare and pour. The wind chimes sang from the front porch as the liquid fell, sunlight peeking through the gloomy sky to warm her back. The spices mingled with the chemical burn wrinkling her nose as her sunken eyes watered. A giggle broke the air and she jumped, cleaner dribbling to the floor as she looked around. There was nothing. She shook her head and yawned before she finished pouring the cleaner, leaning on the island. She lurched forward like something had shoved her, catching herself with a grunt as the cleaner spilled across the island. She stood straight, whirling around with wide eyes as chills and goosebumps spread across her back like wings. Nothing was there. Only the chimes. And giggles. She set the bottle aside and walked around the island, brows furrowed even as she smiled at Riley's laughter. She looked into his pen and froze, lips falling into a thoughtful frown as she watched him twitch in his sleep. She flicked up to the archway, giggles and chimes swimming together. Too close. She crept through the archway and peeked around, but no one was there. Her feet flew to the front door as a mob of footsteps rushed across the porch. She looked through the slender windows framing the door, but there was nothing there. No children, no cars, no neighbors. There wasn't even wind. She stepped back and crossed her arms, chimes fading into the background as she sighed and rubbed her eyes, not daring to look at herself in the foyer mirror. She pinched the bridge of her nose, groaning and shaking her head, then waiting for the head rush to abate before returning to the kitchen. She filled the mop with water and dragged the pad by the back door, along the wall, and in front of the pantry, feet sliding on the water twice. She slipped a third as she passed the island, body almost pulled backwards. Her hand slammed down, clawing the edge of the island, a stool leaning over her legs as she went taut and waited. When nothing else moved, she pulled herself up and panted, looking down at the dry floor she'd stood on and frowning. She groaned, joints aching as she shut her eyes and stretched her back, mouth sliding open in a yawn before her arms crashed down into her thighs. She licked her lips, sighed, and pushed the mop until the kitchen was done, half-heartedly humming part of an old song. She swayed her hips in the kitchen archway, bringing the mop to her mouth like a microphone and singing the few lyrics that came to mind in a rush of energy. She smiled at herself, chuckling as her eyes cracked open. The smile fell as she sighed, body deflating as the energy flew out of her breath. She looked down the hall, pursed her lips, and shuffled into the sitting room across from the foyer, pushing the mop at the edge of the living room archway and along the walls. She sighed, scrubbing quickly as she passed the windows on the far wall, heavy eyes blinking as chimes sang from the other side of the glass. She furrowed her brows and stood upright, looking to the front door. The chimes came from behind. She whirled around, mop clutched as she stared at the glass, the snowy world outside empty and still. She flicked around the dirty white lawn, body stone still, as the sweet sound fluttered inside and circled her. She stepped back, gulping as tired eyes came alive but still couldn't find anything to make the noise. Her ears perked as she neared the foyer, the chimes coming from in front and behind. She whirled around, the chimes following her face as she came to stare at the front door, flitting between the windows either side. She breathed a chuckle, letting it fall twice more, unstitching the tension from her limbs with each, until she hunched over the mop and laughed at herself. Her head fell back, eyes shut in a tired chuckle before she hummed and finished the sitting room, mumbling to herself around a yawn. She tiptoed back into the kitchen, floor dry, and peeked around the island, grinning at Riley's chest as it rose and fell. Then she picked up the mop and set to work down the hall, backing past the stairs and going into the bathroom. The goblin of her reflection greeted her, dark circles and bags around bloodshot eyes, flesh hanging off her bones, hair an uncombed mess of a bun at her nape. She sighed and looked away, yawning again and ignoring her morning breath as she cleaned the floor back in the doorway. Her elbow caught the doorknob. Wincing and cursing, she kicked the door open with her foot and froze at the figure rising in the mirror. She flicked to it and found the shadow of the mop. She rolled her eyes and backed into the hall, passing the 3 small mirrors facing the stairs. The chimes twinkled off the wall, and she chuckled. Funny how sound bounces. Shoulders beginning to burn as she scrubbed. She passed the first mirror. A small figure jumped up, but when she turned to it, it was only a rail on the stairs. As she passed the second and largest mirror, another figure shuffled and spun, hunched like a crone. She whirled and sighed, finding her own reflection coming back from the mirror in the foyer. She scrubbed, backing closer to the kitchen and passing the third, ignoring the figure to round the corner and drag herself into the foyer with a yawn that brought stars to her eyes. She slung the mop side to side from wall to stairs, passing the mirror on her left and humming, body thrown like the mop. Her face hung on her skull, voice low and broken as her stomach growled. Her head swam as she stood, leaning on the mop, blinking away the stars and static until the world came back clear. A tall, pale shadow moved behind the stairs. She turned, but it was gone. She spun and stared at the emptiness, nothing watching her as carefully as the darkness. And she swallowed. Giggles whispered from the kitchen, harmless, gentle things that set her hair on end and made her stomach clench. She ground her teeth and padded quietly past the stairs, fingers clutching the mop as the laughter came louder and shrill as she approached. She rounded the corner. The voices died. She froze. The air was thick, like a dozen strangers had all turned to see who dared walk into their private place. But there was nothing and no one. Just the thrum of the AC heater and the sheen of sunlight on the floor. "Riley?" She breathed with furrowed brows, tiptoeing around the island and past him when she found his big green eyes shut. She opened the back door and leaned outside, ears pricked and head swiveling around. The only sound was traffic. She shut the door behind her and went to the front, peeking through the windows before opening it and stepping out onto the freshly swept mat. She crossed her arms and looked from one end of the porch to the other, eyes squinting in the late morning light bouncing off the fresh snow and skin bristling in the stagnant chill. She turned her back on the world and shut the door behind her. Chimes rang behind as she picked up the mop, clearing her throat and hurrying to finish the foyer and living room before hanging it in the closet. The high twang of metal on metal fluttered through the front door as she leaned over Riley's mat, his chubby face squishing as he turned over and squirmed, big eyes creaking open and shining like emeralds. She ignored the pang in her chest at the thought of emerald eyes beneath golden hair, leaning down to smile at him and his beaming face. He giggled softly and tenderly, sweetening the air better than any chime or song and laugh. She crouched down, sitting on her heels as she tickled his sides, pulling laughter from him as he wriggled side to side. He reached for her, and she gave him a hand, flexing her fingers in his grip before he popped them into his mouth and suckled. "Are you hungry, little man?" She smiled wide and nodded dramatically, mouthing yes, before she pulled the blanket off of him and smelt. "You're still clean. Not for long, I imagine. All right, Mommy needs her fingers back so that she can finish the house. Then I'll feed you, okay?" He smiled like he understood, deep eyes watching as she stood and wiped her hands down her baggy overalls. She blew him a kiss and walked around the island, sighing with a grin as something cold uncoiled inside. Her chest unclenched. Her hairs settled. The nothing didn't feel like a stalking cat just above her, watching her go into the living room to straighten and tidy and throw away their sitting garbage. She was alone, and it made the nest of serpents in her gut sleep. Once the garbage was gone and everything was straightened, Sarah went back into the kitchen to check on Riley. He was awake and fiddling with his blanket before tossing it aside for one of his plushy ravens. His little brows were furrowed, Cupid's bow lips tight and frowning, head down and glaring at the little black bird. Such a tiny face, yet so full of decision, like he'd spent the better half of his day figuring out the toy in his hand and didn't care for it. She slipped back so that he didn't notice her, turning to the sink to rinse the last of the dishes before she could pick him up. But the sink was empty. She stared, furrowing her brow before flicking between it and the running dishwasher. The cycle started, she thought. But I didn't... Did I just overlook it? She yawned and crossed her arms, the chimes dancing between her thoughts as she whispered, "I must have flipped into autopilot." She smirked and shrugged her shoulders, wincing as her chest rubbed the denim straps. She looked down and groaned at the wet spots in her shirt. "It's not even that late." She flicked to the clock on the stove and furrowed her brows. "That's not right." She pulled out her phone from her back pocket to check the time, and let it sink to her waist as she stared at the sink. "How is it almost 12? She set her phone on the island and walked around, undoing one strap so that she could feed Riley. She looked down at him, face still twisted in confusion as he played and thought deep and hard about something. She sighed as she leaned over him, greeted by his happy eyes and smile. He wriggled, reaching for her with a single loud note of excitement. She smirked. "I guess you take after your daddy when you're hungry, huh?" She laced her fingers under his back and head, but movement pulled her eyes to the kitchen window. She stared, puzzling what made her look. Then her face fell, mouth dry and skin cold. A face. Behind her, in the archway to the stairs, a man stood in the shadows, watching them. She licked her lips and made herself move. "If I'm too still, he'll know that I can see him," she thought. She swallowed and laid Riley down, covering him with his blanket and turning her voice to the closest thing to happy that she could manage. "I'll be right back, buddy. Mommy forgot the formula." She walked around the island, eyes on the window and the man, face forward, heart punching her ribs. He was middle-aged, with short, pale blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. His face was slender, skin pale, in a red button shirt. She committed the face to memory, swallowing against the lump in her throat and ignoring the feeling that she'd seen him before. "Not too fast," she thought. "Act normal." She opened the island drawer closest to the back door, telling Riley she just had to get a bottle. She reached deep inside and slid the gun free from its holster, eyes ever down at what her hands were doing. "Don't look right at him." Blood bellowed in her ears as she fought to keep her eyes from going wide, smiling as she slid the gun out. The man's silhouette was solid in her peripheral vision, his smile creeping up wide. "This isn't a good shot," she thought. "But if I've got a bad vantage on him, then it's vice versa." She slid the gun out and to her side, hand firm, undoing the safety as she shut the drawer. She went to the fridge and made herself hum, opening the door where the man stood and quickly grabbing the first thing in front of her. She set it on the counter loudly, then sprinted on tiptoe out the kitchen door, rounding through the hall to the corner by the stairs. She took the gun in both hands as she whirled into the hall, gun close to her body, finger near the trigger, snarling. There was nothing. She padded past the stairs and turned into the kitchen archway, looking side to side, gun close. It was clear. She backed through the archway and turned to the living room as a shadow moved across the wall. She gritted her teeth, blood running hot as she sprinted on the balls of her feet and leapt, gun pointed into the room, finger on the trigger. Her hands dipped as her head spun around the room, looking through the empty air and running to the sitting room. Nothing stared back at her, the air thick and taunting as she raced back into the kitchen and pulled the blanket off Riley's face. She stood back up and looked around, gun at the ready and face hard. Blood raced under her skin as she looked around and stopped at the clock for 1 moment. 1? How? She flicked back to the stairs. The only sound was the breath from her nostrils and the clanging chimes on the front porch. She stood and let everything flood into her ears, eyes wide and unblinking. Her breath, Riley, the dishwasher, the AC. There was no shutting windows, no creaking from the front doors, no footsteps upstairs. Upstairs! She flicked back down to Riley and quickly scooped him up and the pen together and set him on the back porch, dragging something in front of him and zipping the mesh top in place. She sprinted back inside, shutting the door with only a single click and bolting upstairs, leaping 2-3 steps at a time. She spun around the landing, gun raised and eyes flicking around the dim hall to the twin doors at the end, both shut. She crept up the final step, head bent and eyes glaring from under her brow as she tiptoed to the office and bedroom, flicking between them. If I open the wrong one, he'll know I'm here and get the upper hand. She cursed in her mind and took a deep, silent breath, taking both knobs, one in each hand, and spinning them with her fingertips. She shoved them both open and leapt back into stance, barrel flitting between the rooms as sun flooded in the windows. She craned around the office's left wall, a simple square with bookshelves and twin desks on opposite sides of the room. She spun and leapt into the bedroom, checking the corners, the closet, the bathroom, and whirling around to face the bed. The blankets covered the space beneath. Her eyes flicked and thawed until she settled on a plan. She went to the bedroom door and shut it loudly, walking in place as she made each step lighter than the last. She waited for the man to come out, thinking that she had gone, but he didn't. She rose onto her tiptoes and approached the bed, grabbing the loose blankets and casting them off as she fell into a crouch and swept the gun across the breadth of the frame. Nothing but shadows stared back at her. She sat up, brows furrowed as she looked around, elbows on her knees, and the gun dangling from one hand. She yawned despite herself and stood, opening the door and double-checking the hall and office before she shut both doors and returned to the kitchen, flipping the gun's safety and sliding it back into the holster. She went outside and pulled away the blockade of 2 potted plants and a chair from Riley, scooting him out onto the porch and lifting him out of the pen. His face twisted as a whimper crawled into his throat, legs kicking, big green eyes wet and weeping as he scrunched up his mouth into a weak sob. She cooed into his ear, bringing him to her chest and rubbing his back as she shut the back door behind her. Her tired eyes stood wide open, body thrumming as she scanned the room and listened over Riley's sobs. There was only silence, and cries, and wind chimes. But there wasn't even the rustle of leaves, nor the howl of wind. Friday, January 20th. Sarah stood in the dark kitchen, wide unblinking eyes weeping and blind. Riley lay half asleep in her arm, cooing as his head rested on her breast. She took up the paring knife and set the tip to the scab on her left nipple, picking the cover away and scratching. The cold blade stung like hot iron, but then it was gone, replaced by the dribble of her own blood down her bare body. She licked the knife clean and hummed as she slid it into the dishwasher, a low, sad melody that swayed like water. She was a statue save for her arms' mechanical movements, shifting Riley carefully but firmly until his mouth latched onto her left breast. He turned his head away, scrunching up his face as he squirmed, but she grabbed the back of his head and pressed him into her flesh, face emotionless as he whimpered, voice muffled on her skin until his mouth found the nipple and took in her milk and blood. Her grip lessened as she hummed, swiveling on her heels and strolling around the kitchen with her loose hair swaying over her back and catching on the knob of the island. She walked past it and past the pane as the hairs ripped free, walked past the stairs, the foyer, the front door. She hummed into the living room, circling the coffee table and stopping to face the fireplace and the television above it. The light of the waning moon fell on her face, reflecting a ghost in the screen, pale skin and dark eyes with a shroud of black over her. But there was something else, something behind the shroud, something white and silver and gold muddled together in a shape almost like a person. It leaned closer, cinnamon, clove, and sage breathing on her nape, sending goosebumps out like waves again and again. Her skin bristled in the wake of warmth that rustled through her hair and wound over her face, mounting to heat like winter's sun across her body. It pulsed behind her, close and closer as an arm raised over Sarah's head in the reflection, fingers like smudges but never touching her. They twitched and bent, popping like each had their own direction to point to. Something else came on the breath, small, sweet as honey and gentle as silk. It wormed into her ears, low and distant but echoing louder into a kind of voice, whispering in another language. It came in time with Sarah's song, each word punctuated by a note as the blurry fingers twitched, strumming like Sarah were its instrument. Her blind eyes sat still, all the world a blur except for her face and Riley and the shade, the gentle haunt and sweet spirit behind her. Its words settled in her ears and sank into her mouth, following the source of her song like trickling molasses until it pooled in her chest, seeping through the cracks of her gut and filling her. Warmth and sweetness and longing worked together to pull fresh tears.
"Outside,"
a voice said in the back of her head.
"It's outside. What you need is there. Find it."
Sarah's chest clenched, throat dry as she swiveled to the dimness, shade gone, and set Riley in his pen, his whimpers muffled as she laid a blanket over the walls. She spun and glided to the front door, unlocking it and taking the handle.
"All you want is out there,"
the voice said as she twisted the knob and pulled open the door. Winter's breath swam inside, blanketing her legs and drifting over the floor as she walked naked onto the porch and steps, hovering left over the snow without so much as a crunch. The breeze parted over the warmth on her skin, still taking up her hair as she rounded the corner of the house, following the barely hidden mushroom caps poking from under the thin blanket of snow. She stopped at the rear corner, the shrinking face of the moon shining on her back and casting her shadow over the house. She knelt, snow melting beneath her into puddles as she sat on her heels before the corner of the house, hands taking up the spade stuck in the earth as unblinking eyes glued to the wall. Something else sat atop the snows within the band of unseen mushrooms, whiter than the dirty floor, almost an oval, but jagged and lumpy. She held up the spade by her face, her reflection black in the polished shovel as the muddled shade loomed behind her, hands outstretched over her head. Sarah's hand shot out and stabbed the earth before the corner of the house, tracing it in a circle just larger than the pale thing sitting aside. She slid the blade under the dirt and severed the face of the turf, setting it aside to dig deep, deep and deeper, piling the damp, hard soil next to the house. She set the spade aside when the hole went to her elbow, dirt covering her arms and hands, sweat dripping from her face and making her black locks stick and tangle in the mounting wind. She sat upright and picked up the pale, misshapen thing beside the hole, face forward until the shape became a smudge blending into the dirty snow. She held it over the hole and leaned close, back straight and stiff, body wound like a cord promising to snap as her eyes bored into the house from under her brows. She slid her arm to the bottom of the hole and opened her hand. The little treasure landed with a hollow knock like dry wood on stone. She turned to the mound of dirt and scooped it up with her hands, refilling the hole and stamping it down tight every few inches until it was level with the ground. She set the turf back and scooped up the last of the dirt that didn't fit, pulling snow and mud with it as she stood and faced her empty garden. The bare raised bed slid past her until she stood at the tree line, arms out straight. Her hand broke open like a book, and the soil and snow fell over the cluttered makeshift grave of the fox. She spun into a wall of darkness, and the warmth was gone, ripped away with the spices, the honey, the fullness and longing of the whispers. She opened her eyes, cold, empty, and breathing in the bitter smell of the AC heater, as something creaked. Her eyes flicked from the bedroom ceiling to Riley's crib, where the sound came from. She went rigid as a corpse. Her eyes blew open, sleep cut out of her as the man leaned over Riley's crib, black in the absent moon and reaching inside. She swallowed and reached for Joseph, jaw clenched as she slowly sat up. She looked to her left when her hand found empty sheets. She looked at the man again and stopped, the heat dripping out of her limbs as cold relief set into her bones. She sighed and rolled her eyes, blinking the gloom away and letting the silhouette come into focus.
"Your stupid dreams aren't real,"
she thought, sliding her legs over the edge of the bed and rising, naked and covered in goosebumps. She chuckled as she padded up behind Joseph, drawing his eye in a smirk, looking her up and down. His dark eyes became like starless night as he turned to face her, welcoming her kiss as she slid her arm around him and shivered at the warmth of his hands. He laced his fingers at the small of her back, head hanging to keep their eyes on one another. "What are you doing up?" She shrugged and kissed him again, biting her lip as their bodies pressed together. "And not that I'm complaining, but where are your clothes?" He laughed. "I know you had something on, because we wouldn't have gone to sleep as early as we did if you looked like this." She smirked and kissed his mouth. her hands going up his nape, arms snaking around him as she pressed their bodies together. He groaned and pulled back. I really, really wish that we could. She pouted and brought his hand to her chest, wincing at the bruised ache as his fingers brushed her left nipple. Are you all right? She turned to face the little light coming from the window and stretched her skin, frowning at the angry scab, a slender, never-healing scratch on tender flesh. She sighed and turned back to him with a smirk.
I'm good. Just leave this one alone.
He chuckled and stood tall, drinking her in and pressing his lips tight. God, how I want to. But I've got to go. She pouted and stood on her tiptoes to kiss his chin.
Well, just keep this in mind for when you come home.
She stepped back and spun, hands in the air with a cartoonish wink before she hugged him and kissed his chest.
Seriously, though.
She reached around and took a handful of his haunches.
Mama needs this cake more often.
He laughed, freezing when Riley made a sound. She went still, moving like a machine as they looked into the crib and stared. Her heart finally restarted when Riley fell still and quiet, leaning into Joseph's chest and patting it playfully.
Sorry.
He picked up her chin between his thumb and forefinger and lightly kissed her lips. I love you. She kissed him deeper.
I love you too.
Now get back in bed.
You think I'm gonna fall back asleep after this?
He smirked. Well, you'll need your rest for later. He kissed her neck and held her firm. She slid into his grip, biting her lip and smiling as her hands found the hills of his arms. Her face and throat went hot, spreading into her chest, her stomach, as he kissed his way to her mouth. He stood slowly and smirked down at her. For later. She nodded, breathing deep and chuckling despite her fluttering heart.
Later.
But later, under the warmth of the blankets, as wakeful eyes followed the imperfections of the ceiling to the window and the stars above, she sighed, sleep far away and refusing to visit again. She groaned and flicked back up to the ceiling, casting the blanket off and sitting up against the headboard. Her hands fell dead in her lap, toying with the strings of Joseph's pajama bottoms she'd slipped on. She picked up her phone and checked the time, sighing as she dropped it beside her and stared at the bedroom door, then Riley, then the phone again.
If I'm gonna be up, I might as well be up.
She swung her legs over the side of the bed, phone in hand as she passed Riley, asleep and still as death, before sprinting downstairs for the kitchen. She blinked against the lights as she flicked them on, shuffling between the fridge, island, and stove as she made an omelette and sipped at her black coffee. Finished, she took her plate and a fresh cup to the room, shivering in the cool upstairs air seeping through her tank top. She shut the door and sat on her bed, a blanket over her lap as she faced the window and ate, humming at her handiwork, smiling as the sun crested and landed warm on her skin. Pastels and gems glowed in the once gray sky and snow, lighting the ground and trees ablaze in orange, pink, and red. She sighed and took another forkful of breakfast.
Thank you, God, for that sunrise,
she whispered.
You really are an artist. I gotta hand it to you.
She smiled and chuckled, then stopped, brows furrowing.
Am I praying now?
She thought, and flicked over to the drawer in her nightstand.
It's been a while, huh? I wonder if he can even hear me anymore.
She set the plate aside and opened the drawer, reaching beside the dusty Bible to the simple gold chain, pulling it free until the golden cross hung in the air. She took it with her other hand and cradled it over her lap, like she held Riley, thumb wiping the dust from the sparkling gold. She sighed, smiling sadly.
Maybe it's time.
Sarah looked over the playing cards and sighed, flicking up to Maddie across from the kitchen table, her straight dark hair down her shoulders over a t-shirt and sweats.
Anything?
Maddie asked, breasting her cards and sipping her pop. Sarah shook her head.
Go fish.
Maddie rolled her eyes. Midday sun coming through her kitchen window and onto the army of figurines on the shelves lining the walls.
You want to play something different? We've been at Go Fish for an hour?
They laughed, and Sarah nodded, biting into her sandwich and setting it down, missing the plate. She sighed and rolled her eyes, plating it and apologizing around her food.
You sure you're all right?
Sarah nodded.
This is the third time you've done that. I'm fine, really.
Sarah chuckled, then yawned, gathering the cards together and laying them out to sort.
And you keep showing me your cards. And you made your sandwich backwards. And I've seen you doze off twice in 30 minutes.
Maddie continued, leaning onto the table with her elbows.
But you're good.
Sarah yawned, and Maddie motioned to her.
Number 2000.
Sarah laughed and slid the cards together.
I'm just tired is all. Riley's not one to wake up too often, thank God, but he has his moments. And I've just been having trouble staying asleep.
She yawned, smiling as she nodded and motioned to her face.
2001. How much do you sleep? You are still sleeping, right?
Sarah nodded.
I am indeed sleeping. A well-rounded 4 or 5 hours a night. Sarah Kennedy Bowen.
Maddie sat back and pursed her lips.
You need more than that.
Sarah motioned to Riley in the pen beside them.
Tell that to him. He gets hot, he has a nightmare, he slept too much that day, he's hungry, he needs a new diaper. I'm up.
She laughed and looked down at him as he kicked and giggled to himself, green eyes pale around a yellow starburst.
Joe can't get up to help you out?
Sarah shook her head.
I told him not to. He's been pulling so many extra hours for us that I don't want him getting any less sleep than he is.
She sighed and sat back, hands in her lap as he came alive in her mind, shadowed and in his uniform, hands on her waist. She smirked.
Sleep's not the only thing I'm missing either.
Maddie smirked and gestured to Riley.
Actually, no,
Sarah said.
We spend as much time as we can together, and he helps with Riley when he's home. It's just his work. I only get to see him if I get up with him and when he comes home. The weekends are good, though.
She smiled wide, picturing them together in the bed until sunrise or Riley's cries.
He doesn't have to work that much, does he? I mean, if he kept his normal hours, we'd be okay, but honestly, the money he's pulling is just enough for us to keep going like normal on top of baby stuff.
She sighed.
We could manage, but it'd be a lot tougher financially. I told him he didn't have to. But he's a man. Money, money, money. He's just trying to be a good father. I couldn't take that away from him.
She smiled and leaned forward.
Besides, the money really is good now. Yeah, you just don't get to see him or have sex with your husband.
Maddie chuckled and set her hands either side of her, like scales.
No sex with your husband, or more money you could technically do without, and you get to get busy.
Trust me, I know. Sarah rolled her eyes.
I feel like I'm going to explode sometimes, but when it happens...
She sighed with a smile.
Well, it's great. And I sleep better, too. Life-altering, you say?
Maddie smirked. World-shattering.
A truly religious experience?
They both chuckled, and Riley joined them, drawing their eyes and making them stare at his happy, beaming face.
He really looks like Joe when he was a kid,
Sarah said to herself.
Hey, do you want something else to drink?
Maddie asked, grabbing her empty plate and moving to the sink. Sarah shook her head, and Maddie continued.
So, speaking of religious experiences, I see you're sporting your cross again.
She turned around, hands on the counter, smiling like she'd won a bet. Sarah smiled sheepishly, eyes falling back to Riley as he found his feet and stared in amazement. Her brows slowly furrowed as she answered.
Yeah, I dunno. I had to go to the church a while back, and it got me thinking. And then this morning, I caught myself praying.
She chuckled and found Maddie again, her face light but serious.
I just got it out. It feels right to wear it, I guess. Like you missed it?
Maddie walked closer, sitting down, face forward and open.
Yeah, I think so. Just all these nightmares didn't start until after I gave it all a break, and I've had some really bad ones, Matt. Like, really bad. Yeah, I remember you told me. No worse than those. When I was in labor.
The pale arms reached out of her and pushed her apart behind her eyes. She blinked until it was gone, swallowing down the echoing cry.
Anyway, I just thought maybe I could try getting back into the swing of things. That's good.
Maddie smiled, reaching across and taking her hand.
You let me know, and I'll be with you. Okay?
Sarah nodded with a grin.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks for being so patient with me.
Maddie pulled her arm back into her lap.
Look, babe, I'm not perfect, and I've had my rough spots with God. You're my best friend. I bought the house because of you, and I'm not dropping you just because you had to work through some stuff. I know, I appreciate it a lot. Honestly, I don't know if I would have done any differently had I been in your shoes. What your mom did...
She sighed.
But anyway, if you want to go to church, crack open the Bible or something, whatever, you know I'm available. I know. Thank you. I'm just worried about Joe. He's still bitter about your mom?
Sarah shook her head.
I think it all just left a sour taste in his mouth with the church. The way they handled her and us and just everything. I mean, I'm not pleased either, but I know Father Nathaniel and the others weren't working against us. Bureaucracy. Trust me, no one likes it. But with something as big as the church, it's bound to pop up sooner or later. Yeah. I just don't want Joe to do something because he thinks it'll make me happy. I've been a Christian at heart the whole time. I always knew I'd come back, but I don't know about Joe. I'm worried he might be done.
She sat back and sighed, rubbing her eyes.
I mean, we could always become a different denomination, but I don't want that, so it'd just be me doing what makes him happy.
Maddie took Sarah's hand, hazel eyes gripping as candles in the dark.
God won't leave you. Just talk with Joe. Lay everything out. The enemy can't work in the light if there aren't any secrets. There's nothing you can twist.
She grinned and nodded.
I know. I know you know. You're a smart cookie. You're just dreading it.
Sarah chuckled with a nod.
Well, you can always just have him come over here and get a little exposed, talking about it again without the threat of commitment. If he's not expecting a fight, he might actually be willing to come back.
She shrugged.
Besides, I really miss having you guys over here. I'm getting lonely.
Sarah motioned around at the figurines with a smirk.
I noticed. Yeah, the collection's grown. Leave an old woman her habits. You're not old, Mother Madeline. I'm still older than you. By a month. Still a month.
They laughed.
But seriously, you guys are always welcome over here. And since my work's mostly from home now, I'm almost always here. And alone. And wanting company.
She widened her eyes and slapped on a gaping smile.
Seriously, I'm going insane all by myself.
You were crazy before that. Maddie snapped back to normal and sat into her chair.
Fair. But if you guys need some rest, I could always take Riley for a few hours. Or if you guys want some alone time, I could always watch him for the day. Let you get a hot date with your man.
Sarah smiled wide.
God, that would be great. I don't think we've been on a date since... Wow, maybe the second trimester? Well, my arms are open. And he's a really well-behaved baby. Seriously, you are the luckiest woman on the planet. Besides, it'll give me practice for my future kid. Sweetie, you need a man before you get a baby.
Sarah pursed her lips and sat back, crossing her legs and arms.
First of all, no. Second of all, maybe I'll find me a nice man like Joe, and we'll get hitched in a month.
She shrugged, eyes shut and mouth frowning dramatically. She peeked out from under her lids.
Joe doesn't have any attractive single coworkers, does he?
Sarah shrugged with a wide smile.
Come over sometime and ask him yourself, 'cause I think they're all...
She held up her hands and grabbed loosely at the air, biting her lip.
You know? Joe's the best, of course, but there's still plenty of lookers.
Maddie imitated Sarah's hands.
What's this?
She did it again.
You are absolutely no help, I swear.
Sarah shrugged. Her eyes flicked to the window as something moved, and she stared at the crow. It squawked and ruffled its wings. Maddie turned and furrowed her brow.
What is it with you and those birds?
I don't know. Sarah muted the television as headlights beamed through the living room window with rumbles of Joseph's truck. She stood as it parked and the engine cut, making her way to the door with a long yawn and stretch. She opened it as he came up the steps, face expressionless until he saw her and smiled. A simple, small thing that lit his eyes before he leaned down to peck her lips. "Did you eat?" he asked as they went in together, her taking his backpack and lunch bag and setting it in the kitchen to deal with later.
Yeah, after you called.
She yawned, turning from the kitchen door to find him leaning on the wall of the sitting room, uniform still hanging off him and covered in new stains. She closed the distance and unzipped the top, sliding it down his shoulders until the white undershirt gleamed, clinging to his damp skin. She ignored the smell and the lukewarm feel of wet cotton and wrapped her arms around him. He stepped into her, fitting their bodies together as they breathed, his hands coming to the small of her back and the other to her head. She hugged him tighter and looked up into his sunken, dark eyes.
I love you.
He flicked a smile and kissed her, falling into her as he breathed on her skin and held her against himself. He pulled back with a tired sigh, clean hand cupping her face as he said low, "I love you too."
You want to sit a minute before bed?
He nodded and took her hand, pulling them both into the living room where they fell into the couch, the arms of his uniform flapping either side of him like dead wings. She slid against his side and leaned her head on the crook of his chest and shoulder, his arm coming up behind her. She breathed deeply with him as his head sank against the back of the couch, setting her hand under his chest, thumb idly stroking the damp fabric. He brought her hand to his mouth, kissing her knuckles with a smirk and returning it as his eyes shut. Warmth rolled off of him, settling into her skin as her breathing settled with his. Each sigh lulled her closer to him, like she could reach past his skin and flesh and bone and touch the real him at the center. His hand slid from over hers, falling palm up on his hip. She flicked to it and the creases and calluses, the veins in his arms, the resting cords of muscle he put on working over the years. For her. For us, she thought. Something warm stretched awake inside her as she trailed up his arms to his shoulders and chest and the grooves in his throat, the stubble on his hard jaw. Her tired eyes opened and cleared. She rubbed her legs against his, an idle hand sliding on his chest. Later, his voice rung in the back of her head. He smiled with a breathy laugh. "What are you doing?" He looked down at her hand, then her, and his eyes cleared, the smile drooping into parted lips. Her hand fell to his stomach and fell and fell. She bit her lip with a smirk as he took a sharp breath and groaned. His hand slid up her arm as she continued, finding her face and kissing her. "You sure? It's late."
I've been waiting for this literally all day.
She smiled, pulling her hand away to poke his chest.
I'll take what I can get. 2 minutes or 2 hours. I just need something.
He smiled wide, eyes falling to her mouth. Who am I to refuse? He took her face and kissed her deeply, pulling her against him onto his lap and shimmying his uniform down his thighs. Wait. He set his hand on her chest. Riley?
Already put him down for the night.
She took his hand and moved it where she wanted it, biting her lip with a smile. In the end, the neighbors didn't call in a complaint and they didn't wake Riley. They simply breathed beside one another on the floor, leaned against the couch, basking. They smiled at one another with wide, dopey smiles and stolen kisses before they stood, thrumming, and turned out the lights of the house. Sarah sighed and grinned, eyes heavy as he led her upstairs with twined fingers. I think that's just what the doctor ordered, he said, glancing over his shoulder. They rounded the banister, and she popped onto her tiptoes to kiss him, patting his chest.
And it wasn't too late, after all. I did say even a couple of minutes.
It was at least a few.
More than a few.
She grinned and kissed him again, pulling him to the bedroom door with a small yawn.
Maybe I'll get some actual sleep now.
Saturday, January 21st. The house was still and black as Sarah moved through it, Riley suckling at her bleeding breast. She cradled his head in the crook of her arm, the other stroking the patch of pale hair on his head, as she hummed, low and melodic, like a wordless prayer. She stared straight ahead with unseeing eyes, cheeks wet with rivulets, long hair swinging behind her. She passed from kitchen to sitting room to living room and back again and again until Riley had drank his fill. She glided from the kitchen to living room, standing with her back to the fireplace and blanketed by darkness and moonlight. Warmth crawled up her feet and fell down her nape, settling into her skin as easily as Joseph's when they were twined together. It moved under her skin and settled deep into her bones, her guts, her heart, and bristled her skin. Goosebumps rolled off her nape like tides lapping at the shore, breathed onto her as cinnamon and clove fluttered around her face. She stooped and set Riley down in his pen, covering him up to his belly with a blanket and setting a toy next to him, which he took and cuddled up to. She was bent 90 degrees at the hip, staring down at him with an expressionless face until his eyes settled shut and he fell still. She creaked up straight as something settled onto her shoulder, a hand, or the shadow of one, resting on her skin like a bird as lips tickled her ear.
Outside,
a gentle, sweet voice whispered. Lips brushed her ears and skittered over her cheeks, leaving the tingling burn of cayenne and mint as allspice fluttered up her nose.
Outside, Sarah, it's outside. You have to go.
The hands gripped her tighter like a mother on her wedding day. Sarah shuddered with a flash of her own wedding. Gown, chapel, seats, food, everything was perfect. Everything was more so for her mother's absence, for the lack of a mother's touch on her shoulders, or a kiss, or a word. Silence.
Sarah.
The voice came sharper, shoving the memories back.
Outside. What you want is outside. Quickly. Don't leave it for morning. It's too important.
Sarah's voice was dead, but the words came out as a breath. The hands on her shoulders, the lips at her ear, a body against her back, they all stopped. The fingers tightened with fingernails digging in sharply. The lips pressed together around words that she couldn't hear. The body molded against her, closer than Joseph, touching past her skin and into something further than flesh, further than matter. It stopped, and the air was sweet and warm again. The hands were encouraging as they pushed her forward. The heat was welcome against the cold as she turned the knob of the front door, and it opened.
That's very important, my dear. Now don't leave it.
Sarah stepped over the threshold and onto the front porch, the wind swimming around her and the warm breath over her bare skin like a fur coat. She descended the snow-covered steps, silence coming from under her where there should have been crunching and sloshing, turning right and gliding over the snow like the wind carried her. She rounded the front corner and flew past the composter, turning and stopping at the rear corner of the house. She knelt before the spade, taking it in hand as she cut the turf between the corner of the house and the hidden bulbs of mushrooms, setting aside a slab larger than her head. She set the blade to the earth, unblinking eyes boring into the house and leaving the nebulous white shape in the corner of her vision, never in focus, never uniform, whiter than the snow. Shovel after shovel, she reached deeper into the ground, piling the earth into a nearby mound, and stopping only when it was wide enough to stir her arm elbow deep. She sunk the spade into the ground and picked up the heavy white thing beside the house, hovering it over her lap before leaning forward. Her eyes were glued to the house as she lifted the heavy thing over the hole and lowered it into the bottom with a hollow thunk. She pulled her dirt-covered arms free and scooped the dirt from the mound back into the hole, waiting until the thing at the bottom was covered before she compacted the earth. She pushed and shoved with her whole body, heaving as she slammed the flat of her palm into the dirt to make it fit, hair flying as she reared up and pummeled the ground like a polar bear breaking ice. She stopped, looming over the level earth, panting from an expressionless face, and set the turf back in place, scooping up as much dirt and snow as she could in her hands that was left over, and walking between her raised beds. She held out her arms and opened her palms like a book, dumping the dirt onto the unmarked grave by the tree line. She went back for more dirt and again, and a fourth time, gliding over the dirty snow with only the waning moon and sharp-eyed shadows as witness. With the final deposit, those shadows swarmed her, clambering up her and swimming into her eyes. Darkness took her. The warmth left her depths, the spices and honey left the air, and the filling darkness had receded. She rolled under the covers until her back was to the bedroom window and she could nest in Joseph's chest and arms. She hummed, pulling herself against him, weaving their legs together and kissing just under his clavicle. He stirred against her, hips moving on their own to find her as his head stooped, mouth resting above her face.
"Good morning, handsome,"
she whispered, looking up to kiss his lips. He smiled, hand pulling her closer by the small of her back. He deepened the kiss with a smirk, pushing one leg between hers as he pulled his head back. "Good morning, gorgeous."
"Gorgeous, huh? Not just beautiful?"
"After last night?" He shook his head. "You're Mrs. Gorgeous Bowen this morning." She smiled, wrinkling her nose at his morning breath and kissing him anyway.
"Well then, I change mine. You're...
Dashing, he chuckled. Hot?
Debonair."
They smiled, and he slid his leg higher. She chuckled at his touch, giving a faux gasp.
"Mr. Debonair Bowen, that isn't very gentlemanly of you."
He smiled and kissed her neck, whispering, "Who said I was a gentleman?" He pushed her onto her back, hands on her sides as the sun crested through the window, his mouth lower and lower. Riley whimpered.
"Not now, buddy,"
she thought. Riley screamed, a high and sad thing that rushed up into a desperate, angry, hoarse wail. Joseph's head fell onto her lower stomach with a sigh as Sarah wiped her hands down her face with a guttural breath. She sat up and took Joseph's face in her hands.
"Hold that thought."
She pecked his lips and slid off the bed, finding Riley squirming on his back until their eyes met. He hiccuped and settled, face still twisted into an ugly scowl. She smiled down at him and bopped his nose before stripping his onesie and diaper. She flung her head to the side and held her breath. "Oh my God, what did you eat, kid?" Joseph said, half laughing on his stomach as Sarah dropped it in the diaper genie.
"Something died in you, huh?"
Sarah said with a grimace, ignoring the gag on her throat. She pulled out the wipes as Joseph stood and grabbed Riley's legs with a small smile. She grinned back and cleaned him, putting him in a fresh diaper and sighing as she looked up, laughing at the wide grin plastered across Joseph's face.
What?
Just watching you. You're a good mom. He closed the distance with a toothy grin and took her hands. It's incredibly sexy, you know.
Just don't start calling me Mommy, all right?
He chuckled and kissed her forehead. It's a different kind, but there's just something about watching you be a mom. Maybe it's just the maternal nature, but you are very sexy, Mrs. Bowen. You really are. She laughed.
No, you're sexy. You look like a Playgirl model, mechanic section.
That's not how it works, he teased.
I'm just a mess.
She sighed, slumping, eyes falling as everything tumbled from her mouth.
I'm nothing but split ends and 10 extra pounds that will not go away. I hardly pay attention to you anymore. I'm bloated. Look like a corpse half the time from exhaustion.
He picked up her face and stroked her cheek, eyes warm but firm, face serious, like her brother when she'd cry. Sarah, you're not just a woman or a wife anymore, you're a mother. You're something brand new and different. So what if you have split ends, no makeup, and some extra weight? It's the first month, babe. We'll find a rhythm. He took her face in both hands. This isn't forever. The bad and the good, it'll be gone one day. And I'm not going to worry about the little things when there's so much good that deserves our attention. She sighed.
I know, babe. It just gets to me, is all.
That's okay. He kissed her forehead. If you don't like your hair, then let's get it trimmed. If you want to lose weight, let's start working out together again. If you need more sleep, we can figure out a schedule with Riley, or I'll make you lavender tea, or play whale songs, or whatever it takes, yeah? You've done everything you set your mind to for as long as I've known you. Together, we're unstoppable. Besides, you're not the only one who's put on some baby weight. She chuckled and slapped his chest.
Where?
He grabbed his stomach, poking it out like a boy. She laughed and admired it, nodding.
You're right. Like, when's the baby due?
She smiled wide and rose onto her tiptoes to kiss him, pulling him into a hug and sighing against his chest, the joy pushed away by a distant, cold ache.
I miss you, you big dork.
He wrapped his arms around her with a low breath. I miss you too. But we have today and tomorrow, so I say we make the most of it. She smiled as Maddie's offer popped into her head, looking up, her chin still on his chest, so he had to bend his neck near in half to look her in the eye.
You want to go on a date? Maddie said she'd take Riley for us this weekend.
He covered his mouth with cartoonishly wide eyes. O.M.G. Did the prettiest girl in school just ask me out? She rolled her eyes. This isn't a dare, is it? I just can't handle a broken heart, you know. She kissed his lips with a wide smile that reached her eyes, staring into his and breathing him in.
Does that answer your question, big boy?
He smirked and scooped her up by the waist with a slight growl. She shrieked and laughed as her legs locked around his hips, hands finding his shoulders as he supported her back and looked her up and down. She kissed him as they turned and went back to the bed. Now, where were we? He asked. Sarah yawned, sinking into the passenger's seat as Joseph pulled into Maddie's driveway, parking behind her red car and killing the engine. He set his hand on her knee with a smile. Stay in. I'll get Riley, 'kay? She nodded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes.
Thanks, babe. Sorry.
He smiled knowingly and brought her hand to his lips, kissing it long and gentle before he said, We lasted longer than I thought. Us old fuddy-duddies nearly made it to midnight. She smiled at that, making her whole face warm.
It's only just past 10. But thank you.
He leaned over the armrests and pecked her lips, smiling, lipstick smudged across his mouth. She smirked and pointed to her lips, furrowing her brow.
You've got something. It's right there.
He grinned and kissed her again, smearing the lipstick everywhere with a smirk. It's my color anyway.
Goes with your eyes.
He winked and opened the door, strutting up the concrete path hemmed in snow, leather boots clacking, wind pulling his purple button-up tucked in his fitted jeans. His saunter stiffened to a shudder, arms going around himself in the cold gusts as he rung the doorbell. He rocked side to side, shivering in another gale. He turned back to her with a smile and rubbed his arms. She waved with a pout and an unspoken apology that he answered with a kiss before facing the door and ringing her bell again. Sarah sat back, sighing as her body sank, mind dripping out of her skull as sleep knocked, pounded, at the door to steal her away. She licked her lips, eyes drifting as Maddie answered the door, from Joseph to her rearview mirror to the driver's. She froze. The furthest corner of the driver's rear view caught something standing outside Maddie's fence. It watched the door, watched Joseph and Maddie as they passed Riley between them. It was there, but it wasn't. It was an invisible shadow with pale, unseen eyes, sharp as razors. Its face was unreadable, blank, a passive observer, but the eyes gleamed. They flamed. They glowed with moonlight. A pale shadow of unseen air. Her eyes were glued to it, unblinking and burning from the air, from the strain to look at it. Her mouth parted, 100 words fighting for her tongue, a scream, a gasp, a warning, a shout, a curse, a prayer. But all that came was breath. Hot breath fell onto her nape and swam to her face, burning her eyes and nose with cayenne and clove over something harsher, vinegar, garlic, sulfur. It turned and watched as Joseph walked back down the drive, Maddie waving at Sarah, but she couldn't look away from the watchful darkness. She lifted her hand and flopped it side to side as Joseph came closer, standing between the shade and the mirror to open the door. She spun, pulling against the seat belt and whipping her head to look at the spot in the fence, heart pounding in her temples. But all that she found was nothing. And nothing stared back. She swallowed and shivered as the breath fell away like a fleeing spirit, drifting to Joseph as he shut the door and held a sleeping Riley against his chest. He smiled wide, face beaming as he watched every move, every twitch, every shift and yawn, every stretch, like it was the most important thing on earth. She gulped and sunk back into her seat, flicking over her shoulder to that spot. It was gone. There was nothing before, but there was less now, like the shadow of a double exposure had been cleaned away. "All right, buddy. You ready for Mommy?" Joseph chuckled, smile nearly breaking his face in half as he handed Riley to Sarah. She took him and nestled him on his back, head cushioned at her chest as he suckled on his pacifier and sighed. She smiled down at him, the tension picked open in her chest, still there, but not as tight, ignoring the raised hairs on her nape. "You ready?" Joseph whispered. She found his face and nodded, and they backed out of the drive to park in front of their own fence.
"Hey, I'm sorry again."
She swallowed, eyes flitting from Riley to Joseph.
"I wanted tonight to be perfect, and I messed it up."
"You didn't mess it up, Sarah." She found his eyes at her name, locking their gazes. We were both getting tired. Did you have a great time?" She grinned and nodded. "Me too. There. It wasn't a waste, and you messed up nothing." He got out of the car, closing the door carefully and sprinting around as the wind tossed his hair. "Actually," he whispered, leaning in her open door to take Riley, "without you, Mrs. Bowen, I'd have just gone to dinner by myself. So you see, without you, there'd be no date at all." He smirked and kissed her cheek, smearing the lipstick still on his mouth. She chuckled and pushed him away as she undid her belt, taking Riley from him as they headed up the cleared path and steps and crossed the threshold into warmth and stillness. As Joseph shut the door, Sarah looked over her shoulder for the pale shadow, for anything, but there was only the wind and the flutter of distant wings. She set her mouth and turned away, walking into the living room and sitting on the couch, Joseph standing and looking her over with pocketed hands. He smiled and knelt, pulling off her heels, sliding his thumb over her arches. She groaned, eyes fluttering shut.
"You don't have to do that. It's late."
He smiled as she found his eyes, resting her heel on his thigh. "I know," he whispered. Sunday, January 22nd. Sarah stood in the darkness and stillness, the only sound her own breath and the howling wind gnawing at their house. Warmth baptized her and seeped into her skin, up from the floor and enveloping her like wings. Clove and cinnamon, honey and fresh bread, churning soil clung like perfume, rolling on her skin like her tears. She bent at the hip, 90 degrees, and set Riley in his pen in the living room, blood and milk still mixing at her left nipple and trickling down her bodice. She stood straight, straining against something heavy on her neck, body trembling as she cocked her head to the side and felt the skin. It was hot to the touch, but it didn't burn, something metal and precious, glinting in the light of the nearly full moon. It was sharp and boxy, hanging from something thin and delicate. She reached under her long, loose hair and caught the clasp, opening it and letting the weight fall from her bare chest, landing with a clank. She breathed deeply, bouncing up with the loss and nearly falling back if it weren't for the gentle, warm hands on her shoulders.
"Outside,"
the deep woman's voice said. Her lips swam past Sarah's hair and pressed against her ear.
"It's outside. All that you want, little dove, is outside."
The words danced through her ears and into her core, taking up a quick tune and hooting and howling, clapping their hands and stomping their feet, taking up a song and chant as they yipped around one another. The more the words danced, the more Sarah's insides burned, yearning for something, springing new tears that fell like ice onto her skin.
"Go on. Almost done, child. Best not leave it alone in the cold."
Sarah glided to the front door, hair behind her like a train and washing over her shoulders as she took the knob and pulled the front door open. Wind ran inside, grabbing at her, pulling for her to follow and breaking the warm coat over her skin.
"Go on,"
the woman's voice whispered in her mind.
"It's waiting."
Sarah stepped over the threshold and down the steps, turning left and hovering on the snow, step by step, falling around her feet, melting at her touch, but it never cried with an ugly crunch. The wind raced around their house like a whirlwind, taking bare branches with it and making them dance like string puppets, whipping the trees like taskmasters. She turned to the front corner of the house and knelt beside its shadow, back straight and eyes forward as the spade shone in the moon, jutting up from the earth. She reached over the tiny mushroom heads outlining the house and carved a small circle of turf, plunging the blade deeper and deeper, muddying the snow with a small mound of dirt, the air alive with it. She sat straight on her heels, heart twisting as she couldn't find anything to bury, but she sank the blade back into the ground and reached her hand over an empty patch of dirty snow. It fell onto something no bigger than her hand itself. It wasn't like the thing around her neck. It was warm and wet with melted snow. It was round, but misshapen, with all its edges tiny and rounded off like a river rock. Her arm shot out in front of her over the hole, and she cracked in half at the hip, face to the corner of the house, burying her arm to the elbow and dropping the little thing with a hollow clank She scooped the dirt up and filled the hole, patting it down and setting the piece of turf back in place before grabbing the last handful of dirt and snow and rising to her feet. She glided around the back corner, following the mushrooms to the backyard and leaving them for her bare garden. She hovered between the raised beds and passed into the shadow of the tree line, branches twining like broken fingers. She held out the single hand over the unmarked grave, ignoring the throaty squawk somewhere overhead and turning her palm over, letting the soil rest atop the snow. She spun on her heels, and the night became her bedroom door. She knocked on the wood, silent as breath, like her ears were full of wax, and it opened for her. She went to Riley's crib and laid him down, covering him and turning to the bed where Joseph lay. His bare skin was ashen in the moonlight, his hair bright, his stubbled face sharp and calm. She glided to his side of the bed and took the blankets in clean hands, peeling them back until she could see all of him laid out beneath her. Her unblinking eyes scanned him from head to foot, his strong body, his sure hands, his skin bristling in the chill. He stirred, and she climbed, straddling him and reaching between his legs. Her mouth fell on his throat, his cheek, his lips, while her free hand took his face and stroked it, expressionless and wide-eyed. He groaned in his sleep, eyes fluttering open and finding her, half shadow, half flesh. She slid his boxers away. "What's gotten into you?" he slurred, half asleep before his eyes rolled back and they moved together. His words faded as the world went gray and black, only the warmth remaining, only the ache and the fullness and the yearning. Then the spark became flame, and she burst, covered in gasoline, erupting in the air and crying with someone else's voice. Then the heat. Something reached inside, covered every inch of skin, pulled her into the fire. The night flashed over her eyes, and then faded again. Here Joseph's mouth, there the darkness. There she clawed his flesh before the shadows swallowed her eyes. And again he lay beneath her, shining in the moonlight as she dug her nails deeper and crimson speckled him like rubies. The fire came again, soaking her skin and screaming in a different voice from her mouth, a dozen hands pulling at her as spice and honey and earth swam around her. Crimson filled her eyes, the smell of copper dulling the world until she shut them and fell atop Joseph. Then the darkness and the breath and the heat and the hands, so many hands, lifted away like 1,000 butterflies and left her alone. Darkness and stillness settled behind her eyes, her breath fading in the distance. She blinked on the waking world and furrowed her brow. She lay on Joseph's chest, his arm over her bare back, as the first beams of light flooded the window, catching the dew of old sweat. She wrinkled her nose at the stink of them, of the sheets, the blankets, the pillows. She pulled the covers away and slid up, knitting her brows when she found her naked body instead of the pajamas that she'd worn. She looked to Joseph and his lower body under the blankets, picking it up and finding him the same. She sat cross-legged, hands on her knees, and swallowed, unseeing eyes flitting over the room before they fell between her legs. She felt the flesh there and winced at the ache.
"That definitely happened,"
she thought, swallowing hard and scooting off the bed, waddling to the bathroom and turning on the shower.
"I could have been sleepwalking,"
she whispered from the toilet.
"God, he better not have gotten me pregnant again."
She rose and pulled the shower curtain aside, stepping in and stopping when she found her feet. She stooped and slid her thumb over the darker skin, wiping away the thin layer of dirt. She licked dry lips under knitted brows and picked under her toenails, dark and crammed with soil and muck. She scraped one clean and held the filth out under the light as Joseph stirred in the bed. "Baby?"
"Bathroom,"
she said distantly, poking at the disintegrating dirt in her palm.
"Come take a shower with me. You stink."
She dropped the dirt into the tub and reached for her necklace. She looked down when she didn't find the clasp and stopped at her breastbone, where the cross should have been. But there was only her skin. Joseph padded into the doorway and took her shoulders from behind, kissing her cheek. "What got into you?" She chuckled, eyes distant as her dream flashed like candle flame.
I don't know. I think I was half awake, honestly.
You were so different, like an animal. It was nuts, he chuckled. I liked it. She stepped inside, voice coming back into focus as she looked over her shoulder.
I can tell. Riley just might have a sibling after last night.
He grinned like a mischievous boy and scratched the back of his head. Sorry, kinda got lost in the moment. She grinned, rolling her eyes before kissing him.
It was a nice change, though. Maybe I'll be Catwoman more often.
Just call me Batman. He grinned and stepped inside with a kiss. After her jog, Sarah heaved and panted at their mailbox, leaning on the fence as she stared at the front door. She opened the gate, lips stretched over her teeth and arms above her head, stopping at the steps. A thin layer of snow crunched underfoot before the rising sun had turned it to slush. She turned back to the gate, licking her lips as she managed her breath. But nothing was there. Nothing but empty air. A real emptiness. Not the pseudo-emptiness of the sharp-eyed shadow. She let her arms down and leaned on the railing, hands on her hips as she looked around, chest burning from the cold air. Almost everyone was at mass or sleeping in. The wind was dead, the sky was clear and full of a white sun that bounced off the snow and pelted her from beneath. No faces, no shadows, no laughter, and no crows. She turned until her eyes fell on the corner of the house, staring, foot shuffling forward to see if it was real.
We had sex,
she thought.
And my feet were dirty. Maybe I really did walk around last night.
She took another step, snow mound crunching as she stopped and swallowed. Her eyes were fixed on the air, the thick, empty, watchful air. Unseen eyes glowed from an invisible shadow. She stepped back onto the path, and the pseudo-emptiness vanished like a mirage. She flicked between the door and the corner of the house and climbed to the porch and the door and rushed inside. Hairs standing up like an open maw would catch her if she didn't run. She shut it and leaned on the dark wood grain, panting and staring past the world. She furrowed her brows and clenched her jaw, eyes flitting through her thoughts.
You're being an idiot,
she hissed through her teeth.
There's nothing there.
She could see the door pulling open in her mind and the path to the corner of the house. She could see the undisturbed snow. She could feel the self-loathing.
It was a dream. You sleepwalked.
She pushed herself off the door and left the thought there, following the smell of bacon and eggs into the kitchen, sizzling pan singing to her.
But what about the rest?
Her voice whispered at the bottom of her skull.
Why now? It's not just the pregnancy.
Hey, babe, how's the run? Joseph asked from the stove, setting the plate of fried eggs beside the scrambled.
Good. Slower than I used to be.
You'll get it back. He kissed her and pulled her up to the countertop, motioning at the plate of crispy bacon.
I thought the doc said less cholesterol.
She smirked and set the dark strips beside her omelet. I'll be fine. One breakfast won't stop my heart.
It better not.
She slapped his butt as she passed.
I still need you.
For the bills and things?
And the heavy lifting and fixing the pipes and electricity. Oh, and I love you too.
She chuckled as he pinched her side and pushed her forward to the bar stools. I feel it.
Right? It's palpable.
She grinned, and they ate, talking less until silence hung like a curtain, blocking Joseph from her mind and letting her dreams well up. The cathedral that was too similar to the Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow, The man and the woman, Riley, the walks, the cut on her left nipple, the way Father Nathaniel reacted to the pendant.
Babe,
She said absently, eyes on her food as he faced her.
My dreams. Do you think they mean something?
I think all dreams mean something, but if you mean like visions or... He shrugged. I don't know if I'd buy that.
It's just... I was dreaming about being pregnant before I knew I was.
She swallowed.
And then there were these dreams afterward where I was eating all this raw meat on our porch, and my stomach always hurt afterward. I was hardly hungry the next day.
She put her thumb between her front teeth and mulled it around before setting it down in front of her, eyes flicking through the kitchen as Riley giggled to himself behind them.
And lately, I've dreamt about cutting my nipple and feeding Riley through the house and digging holes at the corners outside.
I mean, that's not the worst dream you've had. Those night terrors before you gave birth. His face went pale. That was disturbing.
Trust me, I know.
She faced him as he sat back, the light in his face dimming as he held her eyes. She sighed.
I'm sorry. It is the most disturbing one. But the thing is, I do have a cut on my left nipple that won't heal, but it's not infected.
She motioned with her hands as she spoke, ending with them palm up and falling to her knees. She sighed and hunched, face tilting away as her eyes sifted through a sea of unknowns. Joseph's hand wrapped around hers, pulling her eyes to it, and then his face. His jaw was set, and his kind eyes were inviting as the night after a long day. But the dark crystal pools hid something else, like pale fire or electricity. Are you okay? She watched him a moment, her own jaw clenching. Because if you think something is seriously going on, we can always get it checked out.
You're being an idiot.
Her own voice echoed in her ears. She grinned, the worry falling through her like a stone in water. She squeezed his hand.
Sleepwalking. I could have started sleepwalking, right?
He knit his brows. Have you ever sleepwalked before?
Not that I know of, but maybe I'm under a lot of emotional stress with being a new mom and suddenly having my mother breathing down my neck about Riley and wanting to come over all the time and never shutting up about motherly advice is...
She stopped with an apologetic smile. Maybe sleepwalking. He grinned and squeezed her hand. Monday, January 23rd. Sarah knelt in the shadow of the house, its walls hiding her from the nearly full moon. She took up the spade standing between the unseen mushrooms in the corner of the house and carved a circle in the earth. She scooped it up and set the turf aside, uprooting the soil and piling it outside the ring of mushrooms. Deeper and deeper she dug, the disquieted air churning around her like a storm, tossing her hair as she stared at the walls of the house, locks sticking to her sweat and clumping on her face. Her body heaved as she sank deeper, the soil clinging to her arm like a black glove and falling across her lap beside the drops of blood from her left breast. A trickle of crimson stood against her stomach like a star in the night, but she couldn't look at it. Her unblinking eyes clung to the house, watering the snow with her tears and mixing with meltwater as the cold tried to cut through the cloak of warmth and clove and cinnamon. She sat upright, eyes fixed in the same spot as her hand jutted out to the side and landed on something so small and pale that it blended into the snow perfectly. It was tiny, able to be held in her closed fist, with a small round side that tapered into large, deep holes and a sharp point. Her hand moved over the hole as she stood on her knees and bent at the hip, face ever toward the corner of the house. Her arm sank into the earth up to the elbow, and she opened her hand, earth and snow and mud worming into her nose and sullying her hair. The little thing fell to the floor with a hollow clink. Then she rose. She scooped up the mound and packed it into the hole until there was nothing left but the circle of turf, taking it in both hands like a sacrament, and carefully returning it. When she was done, her hands rested on the remade earth. Her face fell to the ground as her right hand became a fist that hovered over the turf, knuckles falling in muffled thuds. 1, 2, 5, 7. Her hand unfurled, palm pressing firm on the bare earth as the snow melted beneath. The air steamed around her hand, and the snow drooped and melted around the steam, flowing up around her. She lifted her hand, the steam still rising, and stood in the suddenly stagnant night. She turned on her heels, gliding along the front of the house, snow silent to her touch. Her bare feet found the concrete walkway and the snowy steps, the wood vibrating like it would creak, but never voicing its complaint. She came to the front door and the knob, pushing it open and stepping over the threshold, hair matted and clinging to her like a madwoman. She stopped before she reached the edge of the open door and looked over her shoulder, weeping eyes settling on the pseudo-emptiness amid their walkway. She turned and stared. It was a woman, a beautiful, invisible woman's shadow on the air itself. It was warm and kind and waiting in the cold, looking at her with knowing, hopeful eyes.
"You don't want to leave them in the cold, do you?"
A familiar voice whispered distantly. She shook her head and held out her hand, bitter, sorry tears tracing her face around a silent sob. The shadow stepped forward and came out of the air, peeling through it like it were a curtain. First the feet, then the legs and bodice and arms, until all of her was free, under the moonlight. Her marble skin and long, loose, golden hair, her brilliant emerald eyes. She smiled and took another step. Her face was love. It was hope and unity and beauty. It was Maddie's face when they laughed together. It was her sister's face when they were young and Sarah would sneak her sweets. It was what her mother's face should have been when she told her about her first boyfriend, her prom, her marriage. It was her grandmother, stern and sweet and willing to sacrifice all for her, even her own daughter. Sarah smiled, the warmth on her skin sinking into her chest, her head, her guts, nestling like a ball of living white-hot iron. Her tears became sweet as she lifted her other hand and beckoned the woman closer. Emerald eyes fell on her, a smile rising higher with each step until the woman reached the porch. She glided to the threshold, gaze locked with Sarah's, arms outstretched as she tentatively set her foot on the hardwood. She stayed a moment, and her smile widened, joy rolling off her in sweet perfume that stung Sarah's unblinking eyes. The woman brought the other foot in, tilting her head as their fingers touched. Then darkness covered the world and led Sarah away.